Friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is another lecture in our series studying friendship in the Bible. And with this week, our reading takes a bit of a turn. We've been reading wisdom literature up to this point. We've been reading from Proverbs and from Wisdom of Solomon and Wisdom of Ben Sira and from the book of James. Each of these writings is a particular genre of literature. For this week, we will turn our attention to narrative, to the world of story, to the crafting of a story. And so our focus or our strategy for reading will change just a bit. I want to start with a broad and basic overview of the two texts that I've assigned for this week. So for this week, we'll be reading two passages from the Gospels. The first is from John chapter 13 through 17, and the second is from Luke chapter 15 through 19. Both of these passages deal with friends and friendship, but in their own way. So first, John 13 through 17. This is the major part of what scholars call John's final discourse. One of the wonderful and distinctive elements of John's gospel is that although he narrates 3 years of Jesus' ministry in the first 12 chapters, from chapter 13 on, the narrative slows down almost to a stop, and it focuses on the last 24 or 36 hours of Jesus' life, which is an intimate portrait of Jesus' time with his disciples. It's a time in which he prays and in which he teaches in a particular and unique way. And so it really focuses in on Jesus' last words. We could think about it as Jesus' last will and testament. And so it is an important piece of John's gospel. Much of it is unique to the Gospel of John. It's a good Bible trivia to know that there is no Lord's Supper tradition in the Gospel of John, at least not here. But instead, we have in John chapter 13 the foot washing ceremony, which is symbolic and significant in so many ways for the Christian tradition. In Luke chapter 15 through 19, that's our section from the Gospel of Luke, we are in what I would call Luke's central section. It's also known as the travel narrative, which lasts from chapter 9, verse 51, all the way through Jesus' arrival in chapter 20 or 21 in the Gospel of Luke. And so we're reading from that central section, chapters 15 through 19. And this is a part of the Luke's Gospel that has a lot of unique teaching that is unique to the Gospel of Luke, some unique miracle stories or healing stories. And so this is one of those places where we can really hear Luke's distinctive theological voice, his distinctive take or portrait of the life of Jesus. And it's also important because it says a lot about meals or about banquets or about parties. And I invite you for this exercise to think of meals and banquets really as locations of friendship. Because in the ancient world, this was a place where friendships were solidified, places where friendships were demonstrated, right? You would show to the world, to your neighbors, who your friends are, based on who would be around a table with you. And so think about these meals and these banquets as a reflection or a conversation partner with our exploration of friendship in the Bible. Now, I've already said that both John and Luke are narratives. They're not poetry, they're not wisdom literature, they're not epistles, they're not the newspaper, they're not a crossword puzzle. These are all genres of literature. They're narratives. And so I want to say a few words about narratives and about how we might read narrative effectively. At least a few strategies for doing so. So first of all, narrative is about story. It's about stories. And I think we all know almost inherently that narratives, that stories matter. Stories, whether ancient or modern, they create worlds. Think about J.R.R. Tolkien or the Star Wars stories or Harry Potter books. These all are narratives that create worlds. Now, these worlds may be fictional or they may be based on the real world as we understand it, but they create worlds. Part of narrative is to create a world that the reader, the audience, can inhabit, move around a bit about within it through their imagination. And as such, because narratives create worlds, they also create their own set of rules, right? Again, look at Harry Potter, if you've ever read the Harry Potter series. There's a new set of rules that guide the storytelling. That in order to inhabit the world of Harry Potter, you have to believe that just behind the corner of a London city street is actually a whole wizard world. Or that there's a sport called Quidditch that people can fly on brooms and throw balls around, right? All of these are illustrations and examples of the rules that are inherent to the world that is created by the story. And the same is true with the world of the Gospels or the world of the Old Testament narratives. There's rules that are part of that world, part of that story world that is created. And finally, I think it's important for us to notice that stories or narratives do something for their audience, do something to their audience that other forms of literature might not do as effectively. So a letter or a speech or a sermon may be really, really good at persuasion. It may be really, really good at persuading people to believe a particular thing or do a particular thing. But narratives do something different. They might create empathy in us. They might move us in a particular way, either to an emotion of pain or wonderment or happiness. But that it's simply enough to say that narratives, that stories do something that maybe other forms of literature do not do as effectively. Finally, I want to say just a brief word about narrative biblical criticism, which is a sort of subtype of biblical interpretation or methods within biblical studies. And I'm drawing here on a chapter by Mark Allen Powell, who teaches New Testament at Luther Seminary. It's in a volume called Hearing the New Testament Strategies for Interpretation. And so this is one method, one toolbox, you might say, or a set of tools that we can use to interpret the Bible or to interpret Scripture. And narrative criticism offers us particular guidance in reading narratives. And so I've pulled out some of what I think are the more important elements of narrative criticism that might help us as we read the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Luke. And so the first is to pay attention to the events, right? What is the ordering of events? How long do they last? What happens first? What happens second? Second, pay attention to conflict. Where do you experience conflict in the narrative? Who is experiencing conflict in the narrative? Who are the protagonists and who are the antagonists, etc. Third, pay attention to characters and their characterization. That's just to say, pay attention to the actors in the story and how they are portrayed, either through what they say or what they don't say, or what they do or what they don't do, right? Speech and acts are really important parts of characterization. So too are words from the narrator, from the storyteller, that explain or give us a description of a character in the story. So events, conflict, character, and then three more things. Point of view. Pay attention to the storyteller's voice. How does the storyteller tell the story? From what point of view? As someone involved in the story, as an outside observer, or in some other capacity? Next, pay attention to the settings. I think this is really important for our assignment this week. Where do the events happen? Who's there? What kind of spaces and places do you notice? And why might that be significant for the world of the story? And then finally, pay attention to symbolism or irony, sort of deeper level things that are happening within the narrative that might be important, that might Irony is a great concept in the Gospels. It's how do we as readers know something more than the characters in the story? And so they might say something that's ironic because we know more than them, right? So pay attention to symbolism and irony. So again, those are just 6 or 7 simple things for you to be on the lookout for through the lens of narrative criticism that will help you engage this material. Finally, to return to our familiar questions for this part of reading the Bible together, the questions related to friendship. So first, what is friendship like, or what are friends like? In other words, what are the characteristics of friendship or of a friend? Second, what is friendship for? What does it do? What is the function of friendship, or what is the function of a friend, in other words? And 3, how, if at all, does God relate to friendship? And then, of course, there's that prompt. According to the Gospel of John, or according to the Gospel of Luke, friendship is blank, and fill in that blank. Now, I imagine that because these are narratives and they're not didactic teachings like we saw in the wisdom literature, this is going to require us to do a little creativity, perhaps a little bit more open-ended thinking in answering those questions. But I do think that we can get at some of them just by reading these narratives in these sections from the Gospel of John and from the Gospel of Luke. Well, I hope I've given you at least a framework for reading this material, and I look forward to our discussion. Happy reading.